Good afternoon, everyone. Today we are going to be reading Pascendi, Dominici, Gregis on the Doctrine of the Modernists by the encyclical of Pope Pius X, arguably one of his strongest encyclicals that he wrote on the time of the modernists, sadly, machinations going on within the world. So let's go ahead and begin. It is long. It's probably going to be another 2 hour video. So let's go ahead and get started. Share screen. Make sure you can see me. See everything. All right. Good. All right. Whoa. All right. So Pascendi Dominici Gregis on the Doctrine of the Modernists by Pope Pius X, dated 1907. On the Doctrine of the Modernists, venerable brethren, health and benediction and apostolic blessing. One of the primary obligations by Christ to the office divinely committed to us by the feeding of the Lord's flock is that of the guarding with the greatest vigilance the deposit of the faith, delivering to the saints, rejecting the profane novelties of the words and the gainsaying of knowledge, falsely so called. There has never been a time when this watchfulness of the supreme pastor was not necessary to the Catholic body. For the owning of the efforts of the enemy of the human race, there have been never lacking men speaking perverse things, vain talkers and seducers, erring and driving into error. It must, however, be confessed that these latter days have witnessed a notable increase in the number of the enemies of the cross of Christ, who, by the arts entirely new and full of deceits, are striving to destroy the vital energy of the church. As far as in them lies utterly to subvert the very kingdom of Christ. Wherefore, we may no longer keep silence, lest we should esteem to fail in our most sacred duty, and lest the kindness that, in the hope of the wiser counsels we hereto shown them, should be set down in the lack of diligence in the discharge of our office. Number two, that we should act without delay in this matter is made imperatively, especially by the fact that the part the the partitions uh, of error are to be sought not only among the Christian the church's open enemies, but what is to be the most dreaded and deplored in her very bosom. And the more mischievous, the less they keep in the open. We allude the venerable brethren to many who belong to the Catholic laity, what is much more sad, to the ranks of the priesthood itself, who, animated by a false zeal for the church, lacking the solid safeguards of the philosophy and the theology, nay, more, thoroughly imbued with the poisonous doctrines taught by the enemies of the church, and lost to all senses the sense of modesty in themselves toward the reformer of the church, and forming more boldly into the line of attack, assail all is the most sacred in the work of Christ, not sparing even the person of the divine Redeemer, who with the sacrilegious audacity they degrade to the condition of the simple and ordinary man. Although they expressed their astonishment that we should number amongst the enemies of the church, no one will be reasonably surprised that we should do so. If leaving out the number of the internal disposition of the soul, of which God alone is the judge, he considers their tenets, their manner of speech, and their action. Nor indeed would he be wrong in regarding them as the most pernicious of all the adversaries of the church. For as we have said, they put into operation their designs for her undoing, not from without, but from within. Hence, the danger is present almost in the very veins of the heart of the church, whose injury is the more certain from the very fact that their knowledge of her is more intimate. Moreover, they lay the axe, not the branches and the shoots, but to the very root, that is, to the faith and the deepest fibers. And once having struck at the root of immortality, they proceed to diffuse poison through the whole tree, so that there is no part of the Catholic truth which they leave untouched, none that they do not strive to corrupt. Further, none more skillful, none more astute than they in the employment of the thousands of noxious devices, for they play the double part of the rationalist and the Catholic, and this is the crafty that they easily lead the unwary into error, and has an audacity in their chief characteristic. There is no conclusion of any kind from which they shrink, or which they do not thrust toward with the pertinacity and the assurance to be added fact, which indeed is well souls, that they lead a life of the greatest and assiduous and ardent application to every branch of learning, and they possess, as a rule, a reputation for irreproachable more mortality. Finally, the, there is the fact which is all but fatal to the hope of a cure, that their very doctrines have given such a bent to their mind, but they disdain all authority and brook no restraint, and relying upon the false conscience, they attempt to ascribe to the love of truth that which in reality is a result of pride and obstinacy. Once indeed we had hopes of recalling them to a better mind, and this end we first of all treated them with kindness as our children. Then we severely, and at last we had recourse, though with great reluctance, to public reproof. It is known to you, venerable brethren, now unveiling have been our efforts for a moment. They have bowed their head only to lift up more arrogantly than before. If they were a matter which concerned them alone, we might perhaps have overlooked it. But the security of the Catholic name is at stake, wherefore we must interrupt a silence which it would be criminal to prolong, and that we may point out to the whole church as they really are, men who are badly disguised. Man, speaking about that even back then. It is one of the cleverest devices of the modernists, as they commonly and rightly called, to present their doctrines without orders and systematic arrangement in a scattered and disjointed manner, so as to make it appear as if their minds were in doubts or hesitation, whereas in reality they are quite fixed and steadfast. For this reason, it would be it of advantage, venerable brethren, to bring their teaching together here into one group and point out their interconnection, and thus to pass to an examination of their sources of errors and their prescribed remedies for averting the evil. To possess in a orderly manner what a abstruse subject must first be all noted that the modernist sustains and includes within himself a manifold personality. He is a philosopher, he is a believer, he is a theologian, an historian, a critic, an apologist, a reformer. These roles must be clearly distinguished one from another by all who would accurately understand their system and thoroughly grasp the principles and the outcome of their doctrines. We begin with the philosopher. Modernists place the foundation of religious philosophy in the doctrine which is commonly called agnosticism. According to this teaching, human reason is continued entirely within the field of the phenomenon, that is to say, to things that appear, and in the manner in which they appear, it has neither the right nor the power to overstep these limits. Hence, it is incapable of lifting itself up to God and of recognizing his existence, even by the means of visible things. From this is inferred that God can never be the direct object of science, and that, as regards history, he must not be considered as a historical subject. Given these premises, everyone will at once perceive what becomes natural theology and the motives of credibility of ex- the external revelation. The modernists simply sweep from the entirety aside. They include them intellectualism, which they denounce as a system which is ridiculous and long since defunct. Nor does the fact that the church has the formally condemned these pretentious errors exercise the slightest restraint upon them. Yet the Vatican Council has defined if, quote, if anyone says that the one true God, our Creator and Lord, cannot be known through certainty by the natural light or reason, human reason, by means of things that are made, let him be anathema, unquote. And also, if anyone says that it is not possible or not expedient that a man be taught through the medium of divine revelation about God and the worship to be paid to him, let him be anathema, unquote. And finally, quote, if anyone says the divine revelation cannot be made credible by the external signs, and therefore men should be drawn to faith only by their personal interior experience or by private inspiration, let him be anathema, unquote. It be it may be asked, in what way do modernists contrive to make the transition from agnosticism, which is the state of pure nonsense or nascence, a scientific and historical atheism, which it is a doctrine of positive denial, and consequently, by what legitimate process and reasoning they proceed from the fact that ignorance has to whether God has the fact intervened in the history of the human race or not. To explain this history, leaving God out altogether as if he really had not intervened, let him answer who can. Yet it is a fixed and established principle among them that both science and history must be atheistic, and within their boundaries there is room for nothing but phenomenon. God and all that is the divine are utterly excluded. We shall soon see clearly, as a consequence of this most absurd teaching, must be held touching the most sacred person of Christ and the mysteries of his faith and death, the mysteries of his life and death, and his resurrection and his ascension into heaven. However, Gnosticism is the negative is. However, this Gnosticism is only the negative part of the system of modernists. The positive part consists in what they call the vital immanence. Thus, they advance from one another to another. Religion, whether natural or supernatural, must, like every other fact, admit of the same explanation. But when natural theology has been destroyed and the road to revelation closed by the rejection of the arguments of credibility and all external revelation absolutely denied, it is clear that this explanation will be sought in the vein outside of man himself. It must therefore be looked for in man. And since religion is a form of life, the explanation must be certainly found in the life of man. In this way is formulated the principle of the religious immanence. Moreover, the first accusation, so to speak, of every vital phenomenon in religion, as noted above, belongs to this category, is due to certain need of impulsation. But speaking more particularly of life, it has its origins in the movements of the heart, which movement is called to a sense. Therefore, as God is the object of religion, we must conclude that faith, which is the basis and the foundation of all religion, must consist in a certain interior sense, originating in a need of the divine. This need of the divine, which is the experienced only in special and favorable circumstances, cannot of itself appertain to the domain of consciousness, but is the first Latin beneath consciousness, or is to borrow the term from the modern philosophy, in the subconsciousness, where also it is the root lies hidden and undetected. It may perhaps be asked how uh, it is this need that the divine which man experiences within himself revolves itself into religion. To this question, the modernist reply would be as follows: Science and history be confined with two boundaries, the one external, namely the visible world, and the other internal, which is the consciousness. When one or the other of these limits has been reached, there can be no further progress, for beyond is unknowable. In the presence of this unknowable, whether it is outside of man or beyond the visible world of nature, or lies hidden within the subconsciousness, the need of the divine in the soul, which is the prone to religion, uh, exi- excites. According to the principles of fideism, without any previous advertence of the mind and certain special senses, and this sense possesses implied within itself both as its own objects, as its intrinsic cause, and the divine reality itself, and the way unites man with God, in this sense to which the modernists give the name of faith. And this is what they hold to from the beginning of religion. Makes sense? Okay. But we have not yet reached the end of their philosophizing, or to speak more accurately, of their folly. Modernists find in this sense not only faith, but with the faith, as they understand it, they affirm that there is also to be found revelation. For indeed, what is more needed is to constitute a revelation. Is it not the religious sense which is perceptible in the conscious revelation, or at least the beginning of revelation? Nah, nay, it is not God Himself manifesting Himself. Indistinctly, it is true in the same religious sense to the soul, and they add, since God is both the object and the cause of the faith, this revelation is at the same time of God and from God. That is to say, God is both the revealer and the revealed. From this, venerable brethren, springs the most absurd tenet of the modernists, that every religion, according to the different aspect under which is viewed, must be considered as both natural and supernatural. It is thus that they make consciousness and revelation a synonym. From this, they derive the law laid down as the universal standard, according to which the religious conscience is to put on the equal footing with revelation, and and that to it all must submit even the supreme authority of the church, whether in the capacity of the teacher or that of legislature in the province of the sacred liturgy or discipline. Yeah. In all this process, from which, according to the modernists, faith and revelation spring, one point is to be particularly noted, for it is the capital importance on the account of the his, historic historic critical corollaries which are deduced from it. The unknowable they speak of does not present itself to faith as something solitary and isolated, but on the contrary, in a close conjunction and with some phenomenon, which, though it belongs to the realms of the science or history, yet to some extent exceeds their limits. Such a phenomenon may be a fact of nature, containing within itself something mysterious, or it may be a man whose character and actions and words cannot apparently be reconciled with the ordinary laws of history. Then faith, attracted by the unknowable which is united with the phenomenon, seizes upon the whole phenomenon, as it were, and permeates it with its own life. And from the this two things follow. The first is a sort of transfiguration phenomenon by its elevation above its own true conditions, and an elevation by which it has become more adapted to the cloth itself, with the form of the divine character which faith will bestow upon it. The second consequence is the disfiguration, so it may be called, of the same phenomenon, arising from the fact that the faith attributes to it, when stripped of the circumstances of the place and time, the characteristics which it does not really possess. And this takes place especially in the case of phenomenon of the past, and the more fully the measure of the antiquity. From these two principles, the modernists deduced two laws, which, when united with the third, which they already derived from agnosticism, contribute the foundation of criticism. Historic criticism. An example may be sought in the person of Christ. In the person of Christ, they say science and history encounter nothing that is not human. Therefore, it is the virtue of the first canon deduced from agnosticism. Whatever there is in his history suggestive of the divine must be rejected. Then, according to the second canon, the historical person of Christ was transfigured by faith. Therefore, everything that raises it above historical conditions must be removed. Lastly, the third canon, which lays down the person of Christ as a disfigured by faith, requires that everything should be excluded, deeds and words and all else, and it is not the strict keeping with character, condition, and education, and with the place and the time which he lived, a method of reasoning which is passing strange, but in it we have a modern criticism. Number 10. It is thus that the religious sense, which through the agency of the vital and manonance emerges from the lurking places of subconsciousness, is the germ of all religion and the explanation of everything that has been or ever been in any religion. This sense, which was first only rudimentary and almost formless, under the influence of the mysterious principle from which it originated, gradually matured with the progress of human life, of which it has been said that certain form, this then, is the origin of all, even a supernatural religion. For religions are mere development of this religion's sense, nor is the Catholic religion an exception. It is quite on the level with the rest, for it was engendered by the process of the vital uh, immanence, and by no way other, and by no other way, in the consciousness of Christ, who was a man of the choicest nature, who, like it has never been, nor will be, in the hearing these things, will shudder indeed, and is so great an audacity as to assert so great sacrilege. And yet, the venerable brethren, there are not merely the foolish babblings of unbelievers. There are Catholics, yea, and priests too, who say these things openly, and they boast, and they go, and they are going to reform the church by these ravings. The question is no longer one of the old error which claimed for human nature a sort of right to be supernatural. It has gone far beyond that, and has reached the point which is to be affirmed that our most holy religion, in the man Christ as in us, emanated from nature spontaneously in of itself. Nothing assured could be more utterly destructive of the whole supernatural order. For this reason, the Vatican Council most justly decreed, quote, if anyone says that man cannot be raised by God uh, to a knowledge and perfection which surpasses nature, but it can and should by his own efforts and his own and by constant development, attained finally the possession of all truth and good, let him be anathema. Unquote. All right, so moving on. So far, venerable brethren, there have been no mentions of the intellect. It also, according to the teaching of modernists, has its parts in the act of faith. And it is important to see how, in the sense which we have frequently spoken, sense, uh, sense is not knowledge. They say God indeed presents himself to man, but in a manner so confused and indistinct that he can hardly be perceived by the believer. And it is therefore necessary that certain light should be cast upon the sense, so that God may clearly stand out in relief and be set apart from it. This is the task of the intellect, whose office it is to reflect and analyze, and by means of it, man transforms into the mental pictures the vital phenomenon which arise within, and then expresses them in words. Hence the common saying, modernists, that a religious man must think his faith. Then the mind, then encountering this sense, throws itself upon it and works it after the manner of the painter who restores the greater, clearer lines of the picture that have been dimmed with age. The smile is one of the leaders of modernism. The operation of the mind in this work is a double one. First, by the natural and spontaneous act, it expresses its concept in a simple popular statement, and then on a reflection of a deeper consideration. Or they say, by elaborating its thoughts, it expresses the idea of secondarily prepositions, which are derived from the first but more precise and distinct. These secondary propositions, they finally receive the approval in the supreme magisterium of the Church's constitution dogma. And thus we have reached the principal points of modernism system, namely the origin and the name of the nature of dogma. For they place the origin of dogma in those primitive and simple formulas, which under a certain aspect are necessary to faith for revelation to be truly such, required the clear knowledge of God in the consciousness. But dogma itself, they appear hold and strictly consist of the secondary formulas. To ascertain to the nature of dogma, we must first find the relation which exists between the religious formulas and the religious sense. This will be readily perceived by anyone who holds that these formulas have no other purpose than to finish than to furnish the believer with the means of giving to himself on the account of this faith, his faith. These formulas, therefore, stand midway between the believer and his faith. They're in their relation to the faith. They are an adequate expression of its objects and are usually called symbols. And in their relation to the believer, they're called mere instruments. Hence, it is quite impossible to maintain that they're absolutely contain the truth, for it is so far as they are symbols, they are the images of truth, and so must be adapted to the religious sense and its relation to man and the instruments, they are the vehicles of truth, and must therefore, in their turn, be adapted to the man in his relation to the religious sense. But the object of the religious sense, as something contained in the absolute, possesses an infinite variety of aspects, of which now one, now another may present itself. In like manner, he who believes can avail himself of varying conditions. Consequently, the formulas which we call dogma must be subject to the vicissitudes and are, therefore, liable to change. Thus, the way is open to the intrinsic evolution of dogma. Here we have the immense structure of the sophisms, which ruin and wreck all religion. Let's see, scroll down. There we go. Number 13. Dogma is not only able, but ought to evolve and to be changed. This is strongly affirmed by the modernists and clearly flows from their principles. For amongst the chief points of their teachings and their followings, which they deduce from the principles of vital immanence, namely their that the religious formulas, that is, to be really religious and not merely intellectual speculation, ought to be living and to live the life of the religious sense. This is not to be understood to the means that these formulas, especially if merely imaginative, were to be invented for the religious sense. Their origin matters nothing, any more than their number of quality. What is necessary is that their religious sense, and with some modification when needful, should vitality assimilate them. In other words, it is necessary that the primitive formula be accepted and sanctioned by the heart, and similarly, the subsequent work which are are brought forth the secondary formulas must proceed under the guidance of the heart, and hence it comes these formulas in order to be living should be and remain adapted to the faith and to him who believes. Wherefore, if any reason this adaptation should cease to exist, they lose their first meaning according to the need of to be changed. In view of the fact that the character and the lot of dogmatic formulas are suitable, it is no matter that the modernists should regard them so lightly that in such open disrespect and have no consideration of praise for anything but the religious sense for the religious life. In this way, with the consummate audacity, they criticize the church as to having strayed from the true path by failing to distinguish between the religious and the moral sense of formulas and their surface meaning, and by clinging vainly and tenaciously to the meaningless formulas, while religion itself is allowed to go ruin. Blind they are, and the leaders of the blind. Puffed up in poured name of science, they have reached the pitch of folly at which they prevent the internal concept of truth and true meaning of the religion in introducing the new system in which they have seen to be under the sway of the blind and unchecked passion for novelty, thinking not at all finding some of solid foundation of truth, but despising the holy and apostolic traditions. They embrace other and vain and futile and uncertain doctrines, unapproved by the church, on which the height of their vanity they think they can base and maintain truth itself. I think this is the paragraph we get the famous quote, I think. Let's see. Thus far, venerable brethren, we have considered the modernist a philosopher. Now we proceed to consider him as a believer and seek to know how the believer, according to the modernism, is marked off from the philosopher. It must be observed that through the though the philosopher recognizes the reality of the divine and the object of the faith, still this reality is not to be found by him, but the heart of the believer. And the object of the feeling and affirmation, therefore, confined within the sphere of phenomenon. But the question as to whether it itself exists outside in the feeling and the affirmation in one which the philosopher passes over and neglects. For the modernist believer, on the contrary, it is an established and certain fact that the reality of the divine does really exist in itself, and it's quite independently of the person who believes in it. If you ask, on the foundation the assertion of the believer rests, he answers, in the personal experience of the individual. On this on this head, the modernists differ from the rationalists only to fall into the views of Protestant and pseudo mystics. And the following in their manner of the stating the question, in the religious sense, one must recognize a kind of institution of the heart which puts man in an immediate contact with the reality of God, and infuses such a persuasion of God's existence in his actions both within and without man, as far as to extend any scientific conviction. They assert, therefore, the existence of the real experience, and one of a kind that surpasses all rational experience. If this experience be denied, some, like the rationalists, they say they arise from the fact that such persons are unwilling to put themselves in a moral state necessary to produce it. It is this experience which makes the person who acquires it to be properly and a truly a believer. As far as this position is removed from that of the Catholic teaching, we have already seen how the fallacies have been condemned by by the First Vatican Council. Later on, we shall see these errors combined with those which we have already mentioned open wide the way to atheism. Here it is well to note at once that given these doctrines of experience and united with that of symbolism, every religion and even that of paganism must be held to be true. What is it to prevent such experiences from being found in any religion? In fact, that they are so maintained by not a few. And what grounds can modernists deny the truth of an experience affirmed by a follower of Islam? Will they claim a monopoly of the true experiences for Catholics alone? Indeed, modernists do not deny, but actually maintain, some confused, otherly frankly, that all religions are true. But they cannot feel otherwise. It is obvious. On what ground, according to their theories, could falsity be predicted, uh, predicated of any religion whatsoever? Certainly, it would be either on the account of the falsity of the religion sense, or on the account of the falsity of the formula pronounced by the mind. Now, the religious sense, although it may be more perfect or less perfect, it is always one and the same, and the intellectual formula, in order to be true, has but to respond to the religious sense and to the believer, and whatever to the intellectual capacity of the latter. And the conflict between the different religions, the most that modernists can maintain is that the Catholic has more truth because it is more vivid, and that it does deserve with more reason the name of Christian because it corresponds more fully with the origins of Christianity. No one will find it unreasonable that these consequences flow from the premises. But what is the most amazing is that there are Catholics and priests who would uh, fain believe, abhor such enormities, and yet they act as if they were fully approved of them. For they lavish such praise and bestow such a public honor on the teachers of those of these errors as to convey the belief that their admiration is not merely for persons who perhaps not devoid of certain merits, but rather for the sake of the error which these persons only profess, and which they do all in their power to promulgate. Okay. Yet it is another element of this part that the teachings is absolutely contrary to the Catholic truth. For what is laid down as to experience is also applied with a destructive effect to the tradition, which has always been maintained by the Catholic Church. Tradition, as understood by the modernists, is the communication with the uh, others of the original experience through preaching by the means of the intellectual formula to this formula in addition to the representative's value they attribute a species of suggestive efficacy which acts firstly in the believer by stimulating the religious sense should it happen to have grown sluggish and by renewing the experience once acquired and secondly in those who do not yet believe, awakening in them for the first time the religious sense and producing the experience. In this way, religious experience spread amongst the nations and not merely amongst the contemporaries by preaching, but among future generations, both by books and by oral transmission from one to another. Sometimes the communication of religious experience takes root and thrives, and at other times it withers at once and dies. For modernists, to live, it is proof of truth, since for them life and truth are one and the same thing. Thus, we are once more led to infer that all existing religions are true, for otherwise they would not survive. We have proceeded sufficiently far, venerable brethren, to have before us enough and more than enough to enable us to see what are the relations which modernists establish between the faith and science, indicating as they won't be under the name history, and his first place is to be held that the object matters of which is quite extraneous. Two is separated from the object matter of the matter. For the faith occupies itself solely with something which science declares to be for it unknowable. Hence, each has a separate scope assigned to it. Science is entirely uh, concerned with phenomenon into which faith does not all enter. Faith, on this contrary, concerns itself within with the divine, which is entirely unknown to science. Thus, it is contended that it can never be any decision. There could be in, there can never be any dissension between faith and science. For if each keeps on its own ground, they can never meet, and therefore uh, can never be in contradiction. And it be an object that the visible world there are some which appertain to the faith, such as the human life of Christ. And the modernists reply by denying this. For although such things come within the category of phenomenon, still it is as far as they are lived by faith, and the way already described have been by faith transfigured and disfigured. They have been removed from the world of sense and transferred into the material for the divine. Hence, should it be further and asked whether the Christ wrought real miracles and made real prophecies, whether he rose truly from the dead and ascended into heaven, he, the answer of the agnostic scientists will be in the negative, and the answer of the faith in the affirmative. Yet there will not be on the account of any conflict between them. For it will be denied by the philosopher as the philosopher speaking to the philosophers and considering Christ only in the historical reality, and it will be affirmed by the believer as a believer speaking to the believers, considering the life of Christ as lived again by faith and in the faith. It must be a great mistake, nevertheless, to suppose that according to these theories, one is allowed to believe that the faith and science are entirely independent of each other. On the side of science, that is indeed quite true and correct, but it is quite otherwise with regard to faith, which is the subject to science, not on one, but on three grounds. For, in the first place, it must be observed that every religious fact, when one takes away the divine reality and experiences of it which the believer possesses, everything else, and especially the religious formulas, belongs to the sphere of the phenomenon and therefore falls into the control of science. Let the believer go out of the world if he will, but so long as he remains in it, whether he like it or not, he cannot escape from the laws, observations, and judgments of science and history. Further, although it be contended that God in the object of faith alone, the statement refers only to divine reality, not to the idea of God. The latter also subject to science, which, while it philosophizes it in what is called the logical error, soars into the absolute and the ideal. It is therefore the right of philosophy and of science to form its knowledge concerning the idea of God, to direct it in its evolution, and to purify it, or uh, to purify it of any uh, extraneous elements which may have entered into it. Hence, we have the modernist axiom that the religious evolution ought to be brought into accord with the moral and intellectual, or as a one whom they regard as their leader, as expressed it, ought to be subject to it. Finally, man does not suffer a dualism to exist in himself, and the believer therefore feels within him an impelling need to go to harmonize faith with science and they may never oppose the general conception which science sets forth concerning the universe. So the and thus is evidence that the science is entirely independent. On the other hand, notwithstanding that they are supposed to be strangers to each other, faith is made the subject to science. All this, venerable brethren, is the formal opposition to the teachings of our predecessor, Pope Pius IX, where he laid down that, quote, in the matters of religion, it is the duty of philosophy not to command but to serve, not to prescribe what is to be believed, but to embrace what is to be believed with the reasonable obedience, not to scrutinize the depths of the mysteries of God, but to venerate them devoutly and humbly. Unquote. It's a good quote. The modernist completely inverts the parts, and they may apply the words with another of our Lord of our predecessors, Gregory the Ninth, addressed to some theologians of his time. Quotes: "Some among you, puffed up like bladders with the spirit of vanity, strive to profane novelties, to cross the boundaries fixed by the fathers, twisting the meaning of the sacred text, to philosophize teaching of the rationalists, not for the profit of their hearer, but to make a show of science. These men, led away by various and strange doctrines, turn the head into the tail and force the queen to serve the handmaid." This is this will appear more clearly to anybody who studies the conduct of the modernists, which is the perfect harmony with their teachings and their writings, and addresses that them that seem not unfrequently to advocate doctrines which are in the contrary to one another, so that one would be disposed to regard their attitude as a double and doubtful. But this is done deliberately and uh, advisedly, and the reason of it to be found in their opinion as to the mutual separation of the science and the faith. Thus, in their books, one finds some things which might well be approved by a Catholic, but on the turning over the page, one confronted with another other things which might well be dictated by rationalists. When they write history, they make no mention of the divinity of Christ, but when they are in the pulpits, they profess it clearly. Again, when they are dealing with history, they take no account of the fathers or and the councils. But when they catechize the people, they cite them respectfully. In the same way, they draw their distinctions between the exegesis, which is the theological and pastoral, the exegesis, which is the scientific and historical. So too, when they treat of philosophy and history and criticism, acting on the principle that science is in no way dependent upon faith, they feel no especial horror in treading in the footsteps of Luther, and wont to display the manifold contempt for the Catholic doctrines, for the Holy Fathers and for the ecumenical councils, for the ecclesiastical magisterium. And should they be taken to task for this, they complain that they are being deprived of their liberty. Lastly, maintaining that the theory that faith must be subject to science, they continuously and openly rebuke the church on the ground, that she resolutely refuses to submit and accommodate her dogmas to the opinion of philosophy, while they, on their side, having on their purpose blotted out their old theology, endeavor to introduce a new theology which shall support the aberrations of the philosophers. This is fire right here. That is true. My goodness. At this point, venerable brethren, the way is open for us in the theological arena. A different task, yet one that may be disposed of briefly. It is a question of effecting the conciliation of the faith with science, but always by making one subject to another. In the matter of the modernist, theologians take exactly the same principles which we have seen employed by the modernist philosophy, the principles of the immanence and symbolism, and applies them to the word. The process is an extremely simple one. The philosopher has declared that the principle of the faith is an eminent, and the believer has added this uh, applies to them. The believer declared, this principle, yeah, this principle is God, and the theologian draws the conclusion that man is eminent in man, or God is eminent in man, and thus we have the theological eminence. So too the philosopher regards us as certain that the represents of the objects of faith uh, are merely symbolical, and the believer likewise affirmed that the object of the faith in God, in himself, and the theologian proceeds to affirm it. The representations of the divine reality are symbolical, and thus we have the theological symbolism. These errors are truly of the gravest kind and the pernicious character of both, and will be seen clearly from the explanation of their consequences. For to begin with symbolism, since symbols are but symbols in regard to their objects, and only instruments in regard to the believer, it is necessary, first of all, according to the teachings of the modernists, that the believer does not uh, lay too much stress on the formula as the formula, but avail himself only to the purpose of uniting himself to the absolute truth, which is the formula at once it reveals and conceals. That is to say, endeavors to express, but ever super, uh, without ever succeeding in doing so. They would also have the believer make use of the formulas which the public magisterium has deemed suitable for the expressing the common consciousness until such time as the same magisterium shall provide otherwise concerning the in an easy to on subject. Some understand it in a sense that God working in man is more intimately present in him than man is even in himself. And this concept is properly understood. It is irreproachable. Others hold that the divine action is one in the action of nature, as the action of the first cause is one with the action of the secondary cause. And this would destroy the supernatural order. Others finally explain in a way which savors the pantheism, and this is in truth, in the sense which what best fits in it the rest of their doctrines. With the principle and eminence of there is connected another. which may be called the principle of the divine permanence. It differs from the first in much the same way, as the private experience differs from the experience transmitted by tradition. An example illustrating by what is meant will be found in the church and the sacraments. The church and the sacraments, according to the monarchs, and not to be regarded as to having instituted by Christ Himself, thus to be barred by the agnosticism, which recognizes in Christ nothing more than a man whose religious consciousness has been, like that of all men, formed by degrees, is also barred by the laws of an eminence, which rejects what they call external application, and is further barred by the law of evolution, which requires for the development of the germs time and certain series of circumstances. It is finally barred by history, which shows that such, in fact, has been the course of things, and still has to be held that both the church and sacraments have been founded immediately by Christ. But how? In this way, all Christians' consciences were, they affirm, in a manner virtually included the consciousness of Christ, as the plant is included in the seed. But the branches live in the life of the seed too. All the Christians are to be said to live the life of Christ. But the life of Christ, according to the faith, is divine, and so too is the life of Christians. And this life produced in the course of ages, both the church and the sacraments, is quite right to say that their origin is from Christ and is divine. It is the same way they make out that the Holy Scriptures and the dogmas are divine. In this, the modernist theology may be said to reach its completion. A slender provision, in truth, but more than enough for a theologian who professes that the conclusions of science, whatever they may be, must always be accepted. No one will have any difficulty in making the application of these theories to other points that which we propose to deal. Thus, we have touched upon the origin and the nature of faith, but as the faith has many branches, and the chief amongst the church, dogma, worship, devotions, the books which we call sacred, it is concerns us know that what the modernists teach concerning them. To begin with dogma, we have always begun indicating its origin and nature. Dogma is the born of a sort of impulse of necessity by virtue of which the believer elaborates his thought so as to render it clearer into his own conscience and that of others. The elaboration consists entirely in the process of investigating and refining the primitive mental formula, not indeed itself, and according to any logical explanation, but according to the circumstances or vitality, as the modernists somewhat less intelligibly describe it. Hence, it happens that around this primitive formulas, secondary formulas, as we already have indicated, gradually continue to be formed, and these subsequently grouped into one body or one doctrinal construction, and further sanctioned by the public magisterium as responding to the common consciousness, are called dogma. Dogma is to be carefully distinguished from the speculations of theologians, which, although not alive with the life of dogma, and are not within their utility as serving both in to harmonize religion with science and to remove opposition between them. and to illuminate and defend religion from without, and it may be even prepare the matter for future dogma. Concerning worship, there would be much to be said, and were it be that under the head are comprised the sacraments, concerning which the modernist errors are of the most serious character. For then, the sacraments are the resultant of the double impulse or need. For as we have seen, everything in their system is explained by impulses and necessities. The first need is that giving some sensible manifestation to religion. The second is that expressing it, which could be uh, done, which cannot be done without some sensible form or consecrating acts, and these are called sacraments. But for the modernists, sacraments are bare symbols or signs. Though not devoid of certain efficacy, and efficacy they tell us, like that are certain phrases, vulgarity, described as having caught the popular ear, inasmuch as they have the power of putting certain leading ideas into circulation and making the marked impression upon the mind. What phrases are to the ideas, and the uh, and that the sacraments are to the religious sense, and that nothing more. The modernists would uh, express their mind more clearly were they to affirm that the sacraments are instituted solely to foster the faith, but this is condemned by the Council of Trent. If anyone says that these sacraments are instituted solely to foster the faith, let him be anathema. So that's it's a hardcore rebuke right there. We have already touched upon the nature and the origin of the sacred books. According to the principles of the modernists, they may be rightly described as a uh, summary of experiences, not indeed of the kind that they may now again come to anybody, but these extraordinary and strikingly experiences which are the possession of every religion. And this is precisely what they teach about our book in the Old and New Testament. But to suit their own theories, they note with a remarkable ingenuity that although the experience is something belonging to the present, it may draw its material in like manner from the past and the future, inasmuch as the believer by the memory lives the past over again after the manner of the present, and lives the future already in anticipation. This explains how it is, inasmuch as the believer by the memory lives the past over again after the manner of the present, and lives of the future already. This explains how it is that the historical and apocalyptic books are included amongst the sacred writings. God does not indeed speak these words, or God doesn't speak indeed speak in these books through the medium of the believer, but according but according to the modernist theology, only by eminence and vital permanence. We must ask uh, then what becomes of inspiration. Inspiration, they rely, is in no wise distinguished from that impulse which stimulates the believer to reveal the faith that is to him by the words of writing, except perhaps by a vehemence. It is something like that which happens in poetic inspiration, of which has been said, there is God in us, and when He is stirred, He setteth us on fire. It is a sense that God is said to be the origin of the inspiration of the sacred books, and the modernists, moreover, affirming concerning this inspiration that there is nothing in the sacred books which is devoid of it. In this respect, some might be disposed to consider them as more orthodox than the certain writers in recent times who somewhat restrict the inspiration, as for instance, in what we have put forward in the so called tactic citations. But all this we have the mere verbal conjuring, for we take the Bible according to the standards of Gnosticism, namely as the human work made by men for men, albeit the theologian is allowed to proclaim that it is divine by the eminence. What room is there left for inspiration? The modernists assert the general inspiration of the sacred books, but they admit no inspiration in the Catholic sense. Paragraph 23. A wider field for the comment is open when we come uh, to what the modernist school has imagined to the nature of the church. They begin with the supposition that the church has its birth in a double need. First, the need of the individual believer to communicate his faith to others, especially if he has had some original or special experiences. And secondly, when the faith has become common to many. The need of the collectivity to form itself a society and to guard, promote, and promulgate the common good. What then is the church? It is the product of the collective consciousness, of the collective conscious. That is to say, that the association of individual conscious, which by the virtue of the principle of vital permanence depends all on one first believer, who for the Catholics is Christ. Now, every society needs a directing authority to guide its members toward the common end, to foster prudently the elements of cohesion, which is in the religious society our doctrine and worship. Hence the triple authority in the Catholic Church: disciplinary, dogmatic, and liturgical. The nature of this authority is to be gathered from its origin, and its rights and duties from nature. In the past times, it was common error that the authority came to the church from without, that is to say, directly from God, and it was then rightly held to be autocratic. But the conception has now grown obsolete. For the same way as the church is the vital emanation of this collectivity of consciousness, so too the authority uh, emanates vitality from the church itself. Authority, therefore, like the church, it has its origins in religious consciousness, and it is being subject uh, is subject to it. Should it disown from the dependence, it becomes a tyranny. For we are living in an age when the sense of liberty has reached its highest development. In the civil order and the public conscience is introduced to popular governments. Now there is a man only conscience. Wait, now there isn't a man only one conscience, just as there is only one life. For it is an ecclesiastical authority, therefore, to adopt the democratic form unless it wishes to provoke and foments the intestine conflict in the consciousness of mankind. The penalty of refusal is disaster, for it is madness to think that the sentiment of liberty, as now obtains, can reside where it forcibly pent up and held in bonds, and more terribly would be its outburst, sweeping away at once both the church and religion. Such is the situation in the minds of the modernists, and their one great anxiety is, in the consequence, to find a way of conciliation between the authority of the church and the liberation of believers. But it is not only within her own household that the church must come to terms. Besides her relations with those within, she has others uh, with those who are outside. The church does not occupy the world by herself. There are other societies in the world in which she must necessarily have dealings and contact. The rights and the duties of the church toward the civil societies must therefore be determined, of course, by her own nature. That, to wit, which the modernists have already described to us. The rules to be applied in this manner are clearly those which have been laid down for science and for faith. Though in the latter case the question turned upon the object, while the present case uh, we have one of the ends in the way in the same way then as faith and science are alien to each other by reason of the diversity of their objects. The church and the state are strangers by reason of the diversity of their ends, and that of the church being spiritual, while that of the state is temporal. Formerly, it was possible to subordinate the temporal to the spiritual, and to speak of the some questions are as mixed, conceding to the church the positions of queen and mistress in uh, all such, because the church was regarded as having been instituted immediately by God as the author and the supernatural order. But this doctrine is today repudiated alike by philosophers and historians. This state must therefore be separated from the church, and the Catholic from the citizen, every Catholic from the fact that it is also a citizen, has the right and the duty to work for the common good in the way that he thinks best, without troubling himself about the authority of the church, without paying any heed to its wishes. It consults its orders, nay, even in spite of its rebukes. For the church to trace out and to prescribe for the citizen any line of action on any pretext whatsoever is the to be guilty of the abuse of the authority, against which is bound to protest with all one's might. Venerable brethren, the principles from which these doctrines spring had been solemnly condemned by our predecessor Pius VI in the Apostolic Constitution Adut, uh, Addutorium Fidei. Whew. All right, big one. Oh, okay. But it is not enough for the modernist school that the state should separate from the church, for as faith is to be subordinate to science as far as the phenomenon elements are concerned, so too are the temporal matters. The church must be subject to the state. This, indeed, modernists may not yet say openly, but they are forced by the logic of their position to admit it. For granted the principle that the temporal matters the state precedes the sole power, it will follow that when the believer, not satisfied with the internal acts of religion, proceeds to the external acts, such, for instance, as the reception and the administration of the sacraments, these will fall under the control of the states. What will then become the ecclesiastical authority, which can only be exercised by external acts? Obviously, it will be completely under the dominion of the state. It is it is this inevitable consequence which urges many among liberal Protestants to reject all external worship, nay, all external religious fellowship, and lead them to advocate what they call the individual religion. If the modernists have not yet openly proceeded so far, they ask the church in the meanwhile to follow her own accord in the direction in which they urge her to adapt herself to form to the forms of the state. Such are the ideas about the disciplinary authority. But much more evil and pernicious are their opinions on the doctrines of the dogmatic authority. The following is their conception of the magisterium of the church. No religious society, they say, can be a real unit unless the religious conscience of its members be one and also the formula which they adopt. But the double unity requires a kind of common mind whose office it is to find and determine the formula that corresponds best with the common conscience. And they must have, moreover, the authority to sufficient to enable it to impose on the community the formula which has been decided upon from the combination, as it were, the fusion of these two elements. The common mind, which draws up the formula, and the authority which imposes it, arises to the uh, according to the modernists the notion of the ecclesiastical magisterium. And as this magisterium springs, it is the last analysis from the individual consciousness and processes its mandate of the public unity for their belief. It is necessary follows, if necessary, follows that the ecclesiastical magisterium must be dependent upon them and should therefore be made to bow to the popular ideals to prevent individual consciousness from expressing freely and openly the impulses they feel, to hinder criticism from urging forward. Dogma is the path, its necessary evolution. It is not a legitimate use, but an abuse of power given for the public weal. So, too, due method and measure must be observed in the exercise of authority. To condemn and prescribe a work uh, without the knowledge of the author, without hearing the explanations, without discussion, is something approaching to tyranny. And here again, it is the question of the finding a way reconciling the full rights of authority on one hand and those of liberty in the other. In the meantime, the proper course of the Catholic will be to proclaim the publicly his profound respect for the authority, while never ceasing to follow his own judgments. Their general direction for the church is as follows: that the ecclesiastical authority, since its end is the entirety of spiritual, should strip itself of that external pomp which adorns it in the eyes of the public. In this, they forget that while religion is for the soul, it is not exclusively for the soul, and that the honor paid to the authority is reflected back on Christ who instituted it. To conclude this whole question of faith in the various branches, we still uh, to consider, venerable brethren, what the modernists have to say about the development of one and another. The first, they lay down the general principle that the living and religion, anything, is subject to change and must be, in fact, changed. In this way, they pass to what they practically their principal doctrine, namely evolution. To the laws of evolution, everything is subject under the penalty of death. Dogma, church worship, the books we revere as sacred, even faith itself. The immunization of the principle will not be a matter of surprise to anyone who bears in mind what the modernists have to say uh, to each other about these subjects. Having laid down this law of evolution, the modernists themselves teach us how it operates. And the first, with regards to faith, the primitive form of faith, they tell us, was rudimentary and the common to all men alike, for it has its origin in the human nature in human life. Vital evolution brought within it progress, not by the creation of the new and purely adventurous forms of, or form withouts, but by the increasing provision or profusion of the religious senses into the conscious. The progress was of two kinds: negative, by the elimination of all extraneous elements, such, for example, as those derived from family and nationality, and the positive, by the intellect and the moral refining of man, by means which the idea of the divine became fuller and clearer, while the religious sense became more acute. For the progress of faith, the same causes are to be assigned as those which are adduced above to explain its origin. But there must be added extraordinary men, whom we call prophets, of whom Christ was the greatest, both because in their lives and their words there was something mysterious which faith attributed to divinity, and because it fell on their lot to have the new and original experiences fully in harmony in the religious needs of their time. The progress of dogma is due chiefly, in fact, to the obstacles of faith that have been surmounted. Enemies have vanquished, how to be vanquished, and objections how to be refuted. Add to this the perpetual striving to penetrate ever more profoundly into those things which are contained in the mysteries of the faith. Thus, putting aside other examples, it is found to have happened in the case of Christ. In him, the divine something which faith recognized in him was slowly and gradually expanded in such a way that he was to at last held to be God. The chief stimulus of evolution of worship consists in the needs of accommodation to the manners and the customs of the people, as well as the needs of availing itself to the value which certain acts have acquired by usage. Finally, evolution in the church itself is fed by the need of adapting itself to the historical conditions and harmonizing itself with existing forms of society. Such is their view with regard to each. And here, before proceeding further, we wish to draw attention to the whole theory of necessities or needs or beyonds they're all there we have seen. It is, as it were, the base and the foundation of the famous method which they describe as historical. Although evolution is urged on by the needs of the necessities, yet if controlled by these alone, it would develop, it would easily overstep the boundaries of tradition and thus separate from the primitive vital principle would make for ruin instead of progress. Hence, by those who study more closely, the ideas of the modernist evolution is described as a resultant from the conflict of the two forces, one of them tending toward progress and the other toward conversation. And the conversing force exists in the church and is found in tradition. Tradition is represented by the religious authority, and this both by the right and, in fact, by rights, for it is the very nature of the authority to protect tradition. In fact, since authority raised as it above congeniences of life feels hardly or not at all in the spurs of progress. The progressive force, on the contrary, which corresponds to the inner needs, lies in the individual consciousness of the consciences and works in them, especially in such of them as in more close and intimate contact with life. Already we observe, venerable brethren, the introduction of the most pernicious doctrine which would make the laity the factor of the progress in the church. Says it all right there. Now, it is by the species of the covenant and compromise between these two forces of the conversation and progress, that is to say, between the authority and the individual consciences, that the changes and the advances take place. The individual consciousness of, or some of them, acts on a collective conscience, which brings pressure to bear on the depositories of the of the authorities of the authority to make terms and to keep them. And with all this in mind, one understands that it is the modernists express astonishment when they are reprimanded or punished. What is imputed to them as a fault they regard as a sacred duty. They understand the needs and the consciences better than anyone else, since they come into closer touch with them than does the ecclesiastical authority. Nay, they embody them, so to speak, in themselves. Hence, to them to speak and to write publicly is bound is a bouden's duty. Let authority rebuke them as it pleases. They have their own conscience. on their side an intimate experience, which tells them at the certainty that they uh, deserve not to blame but praise. Then they reflect that, after all, there is no progress without a battle, and no battle without its victims. And the victims are willingly to be like the prophets in Christ Himself. They have no bitterness in the hearts against the authority, which uses them roughly after they readily admit that it is only doing its duty as authority. Their sole grief is that it remains deaf to their warning. For it is this way it impedes the progress of souls, but the hour will most surely come when the furthest delay will be impossible. For if the laws of evolution may be checked for a while, they cannot be fully evaded. And thus they go away, and reprimands and condemnations notwithstanding, masking as incredible audacity under the mock of semblance of humility, while they make pretense of bowing their heads and their minds and their bands, and are more boldly intent than uh, than ever on carrying on their purposes. And this policy they follow willingly and wittingly, both because it is part of their system that the authority is to be stimulated but not dethroned, and because it is necessary for them to remain within the ranks of the church in order that they may gradually transform the collective conscience. And in saying this, they fail to perceive what they are vowing. The collective conscience is not with them, and they have no right to claim to be interpreters. That's a little shorter one. Oh man, 29 is short. Wow. It is thus, venerable brethren, that the modernists, whether as the authors or propagandists, there is to be nothing stable, nothing immutable in the church, nor indeed, as they without forerunners in their doctrines. For it was these that our predecessor, Pius the Ninth, wrote, quote, these enemies of divine revelation extol human progress in the skies, and with the rash and sacrilegious daring would have it introduced into the Catholic religion, as if this religion were not the work of God, but of man, or of some kind of philosophical discovery susceptible of perfection by human efforts. Unquote. On the subject of revelation and dogma in particular, the doctrine and the modernists offer nothing new. We find it condemned in the syllabus of Pius the Ninth, syllabus of errors, where it is enunciated in these terms: divine revelation, or quote, the divine revelation is imperfect and therefore subject to continual and indefinite progress, corresponding within the progress of human reason, unquote. And condemned still more solely in the First Vatican Council. Quotes, the doctrine of faith which God has revealed has not been proposed to the human intelligences to be perfected by them as it were a philosophical system, but as a divine deposit entrusted to the spouse of Christ to be faithfully guarded and infallibly interpreted. Hence, also, the sense of the sacred dogmas is perpetually restrained, which our Holy Mother, uh, the Church, has once declared, nor is this sense ever abandoned on the plea of the pretext of a more profound comprehension of the truth, nor is the development of our knowledge. even concerning the faith, barred by the pronouncement on the contrary, is supported and maintained. For the same counsel continues, quotes, let intelligence and science and wisdom therefore increase and progress abundantly and vigorously in individuals and in mass and the believer and the whole church throughout the ages and the centuries, but only in its own kind, that is, according to the same dogma, the same sense, the same exception. Unquote. 29. We have studied the modernist philosopher, a believer, and a theologian. Now it remains for us to understand a historian, an apologist, and a reformer. Some honorists devoted to the historical studies seem to be deeply anxious not to be taken for philosophers about philosophy. They profess to know nothing whatever, and in this they display remarkable astuteness, for they are particularly desirous not to be subjected on any possessions in favor of or pre, prepossessions in favor of the philosophical theories, which would lay them open to charge of not being, as they call it, objective. And yet, the truth is that their history and their criticism are saturated with their philosophy, and their historico-critical conclusions are the natural outcome of their philosophical principles. This will be the patent to anyone who reflects their three laws and are contained in those three principles of their philosophy already dealt with. The principle of agnosticism and theorism of the transfiguration of the things of faith, and the others which may be called the principle of disfiguration. Let us see the consequences flow each of these. Agnosticism tells us that the history, like science, deals entirely with the phenomenon, and the consequence is that God and every intervention of God is human affairs is to be regulated to be dogma of faith as belonging to it alone. Wherefore, the things where it's combined the double elements, the divine and the human, as for example in Christ or the church or the sacraments or any other object of the same kind, the division separation made in the human element must be left to history, while the divine will be assigned to faith. Hence, we have the distinction, so current amongst the modernists, between the Christ of history and the Christ of faith, the church of history and the church of faith, the sacraments of history and the sacraments of faith. And so, similar matters. Next, we find the human element itself, which the history has to work on, as it appears in the documents, and is considered as to having transfigured by faith, as to say, raised above the historical conditions to become necessary. Therefore, to eliminate also the assertions which faith has added in the regulation to them, that faith itself and the history of faith, and thus the treating of Christ and the historian must be set aside all that surpasses man in his natural condition, according to what psychology tells us of him, or according to what we gather from the place and the period of existence. Finally, they require, by the virtue of the third principle, that even those things which are not outside of the sphere of history should pass through the see, pass through the sieve, excluding all and regulating to the faith everything which in their judgments is not in harmony with what they call the logic of facts, and not in the character with the persons of whom they are predicted. And thus they will not allow that Christ uttered those things which do not seem to be within the capacity of the multitudes that they listened to him. Hence they deleted from the real history and transferred to faith all allegories found in his discourses. And we pre-adventure inquire on what principle they make these divisions. Their reply is that they argue from the character of the man, from the condition of the life, and the education from the complexities of the circumstances under which the facts took place. In short, if we understand them aright on the principle, which as the last analysis is merely subjective. The method is to put themselves into the position and the person of Christ, and then is to attribute to him what they would have done under the like circumstances in this way. Absolutely prior enacting philosophical principles which they hold, but they profess to ignore. They proclaim that Christ, according to what they call his real history, was not God and never did anything divine, and that this man he did and say only what they, judging from the time in which he lived, considered that he might have said or done. All right. As history takes conclusions from philosophy, so too criticism takes its conclusions from history. The critic, on the data furnished him by the historian, makes two parts of all his documents. Those that remain after the triple elimination above the ascription go to form the real history. The rest is the attribution to the history of the faith as it's stylized. In the infernal history, for the modernists distinguish very carefully between these two kinds of history. And it is to be noted that they oppose the history of faith to real history precisely as real. Thus, as we have already said, we have a twofold Christ, a real Christ and a Christ, and one faith, the one of faith, and one who never really existed. A Christ who has lived at a given time and a given place, and a Christ who never lived outside of the pious meditations of the believer. The Christ, for instance, whom we find in the Gospel of St. John, which, according to them, is the mere meditation from the beginning to the end. Says it all right there. But the dominion of the philosophy over the history does not end there. Given the division which we have spoken of the documents in two parts, the philosopher steps in again, and his dogma, vital in eminence, shows how everything in the history of the church is to be explained by the vital emanation, and since the cause of the condition of every vital emanation whatsoever is to be found in some need or want, it follows that no fact can be regarded as a antecedent to the need which produced it. Historically, the fact must be the postulator to need. What then does the historian do in the view of this principle? He goes over his documents again, whether they be contained in the sacred books or elsewhere, draws up from them his list of particular needs of the church, whether relating to dogma or liturgy or other matters in which are found in the church thus related, and then he hands his list over to the critic, and the critic takes in the hand the documents dealing with the history of the faith and distributes them period by period so they correspond exactly with the list of the needs, always guided by the principle of the narration and must follow the facts as the facts follow the needs. And it may at times happen that some parts of the sacred scriptures, such as the epistles themselves, constitute the fact that created by the need. Even so, the rule holds that the age of any document can only be determined by the age in which each need has manifested itself to the church. Father, further, uh, the distinction must be made between the uh, beginning or the fact of its development. For which is born of one day requires time for growth. Hence, the critic must once more go over his documents, ranged as they, although uh, through different ages, and divide them again into two parts, separating those that regard the origin of the facts from those that deal with their developments, and those and these he must again arrange according to their periods. Then the philosopher must come in again to enjoin them with the historian and the obligation of the following in all his studies and the precepts of the laws of evolution. It is next for the historian to scrutinize his documents once more, to examine carefully the circumstances of the conditions affecting the church during the different periods, and a conserving uh, force she put forth, and the needs both internal and external, and having stimulated her progress, the obstacles she has had to encounter, in a word, everything that helps to determine the manner in which the laws of evolution have been fulfilled in her. This done, he finishes his work by drawing up a history of the development in the broad lines. The critic follows and fits in the rest of the documents. He sets himself to write. The history is finished. Now we ask here, who is the author of this history? The historian, the critic, the assured, neither of these, but the philosopher. From the beginning to the end, everything in it is a priori, and the and a priorism is the that reeks of heresy. And these men are certainly to be pitied, of whom the apostle might well say, they in vain that they became vain in their thoughts, and professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. At, at the same time, they excite resentment when they accuse the church of arranging or confusing the text after her own fashion, and for the needs of of her own cause. In in this, they are accusing the church of something for which their own conscience plainly approaches them. The results of this dismembering of its records and its partitions of them throughout the centuries is naturally that the scriptures can no longer be attributed to the authors whose names they bear. The modernists have no hesitation in affirming that generally that these books, and especially the Pentateuch and the first three Gospels, have been gradually formed from their primitive uh, brief narration by additions and by the interpolations of the theological and the allegorical interpretations, or the parts introduced only for those purpose of joining different passages together. This means, to put it briefly and clearly, that the sacred books we must admit its vital evolution, sparing from the corresponding with the evolution of faith. This traces this evolution, they tell us, is so visible in the books that one might almost write a history of it. Indeed, the history they actually do write, and with such an easy assurance that one might believe them and have seen with their own eyes the writers at work through the ages amplifying the sacred books, and to aid them, and they call their assistants the branch of criticism, which they call textual, in the labor to show that such a fact or such a phrase is not in the right place, adducing other arguments of of the same kind. They seem, in fact, as to have constructed for themselves the certain types of narration and discourses upon which they are based their assured verdict as to whether a thing is or is not out of place. Let him who can judge how far they are qualified in this way to make distinctions, to hear them descant of their works on the sacred books, in which they have been able to discover so much that is defective. One would imagine that before then nobody ever even turned over the pages of Scripture. The truth is that the whole multitude of doctors, far superior to them in genius, in erudition, and sanctity, have sifted the sacred books in every way, and so far finding them in acting blameworthy, have thanked God more and more heartily the more deeply they have gone into them, and for the divine bounty in having vouchsafed to speak thus to men. Unfortunately, these great doctors did not enjoy the same aids to study that they are possessed by the modernists, for they did not have their rule and guide of philosophy borrowed from the negotiation of God and the creditation which consists of themselves. We believe then that we have to set forth the sufficient clearness in the historical method of the modernists, and the philosopher leads the way, and the historical follow the historian follows, and then in due order comes the internal and external uh, critics. The internal and textual critics. And since it is the characteristics of the primary cause of the communicate its virtue, its causes which are secondary, is quite clear that the criticism with which we are concerned is not the only any kind of criticism that which is rightly called agnostic, emanistic, and evolutionary criticism. Hence, anyone who adopts it and employs it It makes profession thereby of errors contained in it, and places himself in opposition to Catholic teaching. This being so, it is it is much a matter for surprise that it should have found acceptance to such an extent amongst certain Catholics. Two causes may be assigned for this. First, close alliance which the historians and the critics of this school have formed amongst themselves, independent of all differences of the nationality or religion. Second, their boundless effortory on the front on which, if one then makes an utterance, the others applaud him in chorus, proclaiming that the science has made another step forward, while his outsiders should desire to impact the new discovery for himself. They form a condition against him, and he who denies it's decried as one who is ignorant, while he who embraces it, defends it, has all their praise. In this way, they entrapped not a few, who, but they did realize what they are doing, and would shrink back with horror. The domineering overbearance of those who teach errors, and the thoughtless compliance of more shallow minds who assent to them, create a corrupted atmosphere which penetrates everywhere and carries infection with it. But let us pass on to the apologists. That is so spot on. Absolutely spot on. The modernist apologist depends in two ways on the philosopher. First, indirectly, inasmuch as the subject matter is history. History is dictated, as we have seen, by the philosopher, and secondly, directly, inasmuch as he takes both his doctrines, his conclusions from the philosopher. Hence, that the common axiom of the modernist school that is the new apologist controversies in religion must be determined by the psychological and historical research. The modernist apologists then enter the arena, proclaiming that the rationalists, that though they are defending religion, they have no intention of employing the data of the sacred books or the histories in the current use in the church, and written upon the olden lines, but real history composed of modern principles and according to the modern method. In all this, they assert that they are not using the argumentum ad hominem, because they are really of the opinion that the truth is to be found only in the kind of history. They feel that it is not necessary for them to make profession of their own sincerity in their writings, and they are already known to and praised by the rationalists as fighting under this same banner, and they not only plume themselves on the uh, economies, which would only provoke disgust in the real, which would only provoke disgust in a real Catholic, but use them as the counter composition to the reprimands of the Church. Let us see how modernist you conducts his apologetics to aim his sets before himself to make one who is still without faith attain the experience the of the Catholic religion, which, according to the system, is the sole basis of faith. These are two ways open to him, an objective and subjective. The first of them starts from the Gnosticism. It tends to show the religion, and especially the Catholic religion, is endowed with such a vitality as to compel every uh, psychologist, the historian of good faith, is the uh, is to recognize that the history hides more elements of the unknown. To this end, it is necessary to prove that the Catholic religion, as it exists today, which is founded by Jesus Christ, as to say that it is nothing else than the progressive development of a germ which he brought into the world. Hence, it is imperative first that all to establish what is a germ was. And the modernism claims that he is able to do given founder and ruler. Then it must be shown how the germ, always immanently and permanently in the Catholic religion, has gone and on slowly developing in the course of history, adapting itself successfully in the different circumstances through which it has passed, borrowing from them by the vital assimilation of the doctrinal, cultural, and ecclesiastical forms that serve its purpose, whilst on the other hand it surmounted all obstacles, vanquished all enemies, and survived all assaults and all combats. Anyone who well and duly considers the mass obstacles, adversaries, attacks, combats, and vitality, and the fecundity which the Church has shown throughout them all, must admit that the laws of evolution are visible in her life. They fail to explain the whole of her history. The unknown rises forth from it and presents itself before us. Thus do they argue, and perceiving that their determination of the primitive germ is only on the priori assumption of the agnostic and evolutionary philosophy, and that the germ itself has been gradually refined so that it may fit in their contention. While they endeavor by this line of reasoning to prove and to plead for the Catholic religion, these new apologists are the more than willing to grant and to recognize that there are in many things which are repulsive. Nay, they admit openly and with all concealed satisfaction they have found what even is dogma is not exempt from errors and contradictions. They added also that it is not only exhaustible, but uh, curiously enough, that it is even right and proper in the sacred books. There are many passages referring to science and history where, according to them, manifest errors and are to be found. But they say subject to these books is not science or history, but only religion or morals, and in them history and science serve only as a species of covering to enable the religious and the moral experiences wrapped up in them and penetrate more readily amongst the masses. These masses understood science and history as they are expressed in these books, and it's clear that the expression of science and history in more perfect form would be proved not so much as to help as a hindrance. Moreover, they add the sacred books, being essentially religious, are necessarily quick with life. Now, life has its own truths and its own logic, quite different from the rational truth and the rational logic. belonging as they do to different order. Visa truth of the adaptation and the proportion both which they call the medium in which the lives and the ends for which it lives. Finally, the modernists, losing all senses of control, go far as to proclaim as the true and legitimate whatever is to be explained by life. We venerable brethren, for whom there is by one and only one true faith, and who hold that the sacred books, quote, written under the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, have God as their author, unquote, declare that this is equivalent to attributing to God Himself and the lie of utility or officious lie. And we say with St. Augustine, quotes, in the authority so high, admit but one officious lie, and there will be not one, there will not remain a single passage of those apparently difficult passages, uh, difficult to practice or to believe, which on the same most pernicious rule may not be explained as a lie or uttered by the authority, by author willfully to serve its purpose. And thus it will come out that the holy doctor continues that everybody will believe and refuse to believe what he likes or dislikes in them, namely the scriptures. But the modernists pursue them their way eagerly. They grant also that certain arguments adduced in the sacred books, in the proofs given doctrine, like those, for example, which are based on the prophecies, have no rational foundation to rest on. But they defend even these as artifices of preaching, which are justified by life. More than that, they are ready to admit, nay, to proclaim, that Christ Himself manifestly erred in determining the time when the coming of the kingdom of God was to take place. And when they tell us that we must not be surprised at this, since even he himself was subject to the laws of life, after this, what is to become the dogmas of the church? The dogmas bristle with fragrant contradictions. But what does it matter, since apart from the fact that the vital logic accepts them, they are not repugnant to the symbolic truth and are not dealing with the infinites and are not the infinites an infinite variety of aspects. In short, to maintain the and defend these theories, they do not hesitate to declare that the noblest homage that can be paid to the infinite is to make us an object of contradictory statements. But when they justify even contradictions, what is it that they will refuse to justify? But it is not solely by objective arguments that the non-believer may be disposed to faith. There are also those that are subjective, and for this subject, the modernist apologists return to the doctrine of an eminence, and they endeavor, in fact, to persuade their non-believer that down in the very depths of his nature and his life, hidden the need and the desire for some religion, and this not a religion of any kind, but a specific religion known as Catholicism, which they say is absolutely postulated by the perfect development of life. And here again, we have a grave reason to complain that there are Catholics who, while rejecting the eminence as a doctrine, and employ it as a method of apologetics, and who do this so imprudently that they seem to admit not merely as capacity and suitability for the supernatural, such as it has at all times been emphasized within due limits by Catholic apologetics, but apologists, that there is in human nature a true and rigorous need for the supernatural order. Truth to tell, it is the only uh, moderates who make the appeal to the exigency for the Catholic religion. As for the others, who might call themselves integralists, they would show to the non believer as the hidden in his being, the grim or the very germ which Christ himself had in his consciousness, and which he transmitted to mankind. Such, venerable brethren, is a summary description of the apologetic method of the modernists, in the perfect harmony of their doctrines, the methods, and the doctrines, replete with errors, made not with edification, but for destruction, not for the making of Catholics, but for the seduction of those who are Catholics into heresy, intending to utter subversion of all religion. We're getting there. It remains for us now to say a few words about the modernist as a reformer. From all this has the proceeded its abundance clearly how great and how eager is the passion of such men for the innovation in all Catholicism. There is absolutely nothing on which it does not fasten. They wish philosophy to be reformed, especially in the ecclesiastical seminaries. They wish the scholastic philosophy to be regulated in the history of philosophy and to be classed amongst absolute systems, and the young men to be taught modern philosophy, which alone is true and suited to the times in which we live. In the desire to reform the theology, rational theology is to have the modern philosophy for its foundation, and the positive theology is to be found on the history of dogma. As for history, it must be written and taught only according to their methods and modern principles. Dogmas and their evolution, they affirm, are to be harmonized with science and history. In the Catechism, no dogmas are to be asserted except those that are to be reformed and are within the capacity of the people. Regarding worship, they say the number of the external devotions is to be reduced, and the steps must be taken to prevent their further increase. Though indeed some of the admirers of symbolism are disposed to be more indulgent on this head, they cry out the ecclesial government requires to be reformed in all the branches, but especially in the disciplinary and dogmatic departments. They insist that both outwardly and inwardly it must be brought into harmony with the modern conscience, which now wholly tends towards the democracy. A share in the ecclesiastical government should therefore be given to lower ranks of the clergy and even to the laity, and the authority which is too much concentrated should be decentralized in the Roman congregations. and especially the index and the Holy Office, must be likewise modified. The ecclesiastical authority must alter its line of conduct in the social and the political world while keeping the outside political organizations. It must adapt itself to them in order to penetrate them in its spirit. With regard to morals, they adopt the principle of the Americanists and or that the active virtues are more important than the passive and are to be more encouraged in practice. They ask the clergy should remain the primitive humility and poverty, and that their idea and their action should admit the principles of modernism. And there are some who, gladly listening to the teachings of their Protestant masters, would desire the suppression of the celibacy of clergy. There it is. This is it all. Mic drop. Boom. What is there left in the church which is not to be reformed by them according to their principles? Yeah, might as well be saying it today. I mean that's how prophetic that is. Wow. It may perhaps seem to some, venerable brethren, that we had dealt at too great length on the exposition of the doctrines of the modernists, but it was necessary that we should do so, both in order to meet their customary charge that we do not understand their ideas and show that their system does not consist in scattered or unconnected theories, but as it were, is closely connected whole. And so it is not possible to admit one without admitting it all. For this reason, too, we have to give this exposition a somewhat didactic form and not to shrink from the employing certain unwanted terms which the modernists have brought to use into use. And now, with our eyes fixed upon the whole system, no one will be surprised that we should define that this is to be the synthesis of all heresies. Undoubtedly, were anyone to attempt the task of connecting together all the errors that have been approached against the faith and to concentrate into one sap and substance of them all, and could not succeed in doing it so better than the modernists have done. Nay, they have gone further than this. Yes, they have. For this, as we have already uh, uh, estimated or intimated, their system means their destruction not of the Catholic religion alone, but of all religion. Hence, the rationalists are not wanting in their applause and their most frank, sense, sincere amongst them congratulate themselves on having found in the modernists the most valuable of its allies. Let us turn for a moment, venerable brethren, that the most disastrous doctrine of Gnosticism by every avenue to God on the side of the intellect is barred to man, while a better way is supposed to be opened from the side of a certain sense of the soul in action. But who does not see how mistaken in such contention? For the sense of the soul is the response to the action of the thing which the intellect or an outward senses set before it. Take away the intelligence in man, already inclined to follow the senses, becoming their slave. Doubtedly mistaken. From another point of view, for all these fantasies of the religious sense will never be able to destroy common sense. And common sense tells us that the emotion and everything that leads to the heart captive proves a hindrance instead of a help to the discovery of truth. We speak of truth itself, and that other purely subjective truth and the fruit of the internal sense and action. It serves its purpose for the play and of words. It is no benefit to man who wants above all things to know whether outside himself there is a God, into whose hands he is one to fall. True, and the monitors call in the experience to eke out their system, but does this experience add to the sense of the soul? Absolutely nothing beyond a certain intensity and proportionate deepening of the conviction of the reality of the objects. But these two will never make the sense of the soul into anything but sense, nor will they alter its nature, which is liable deception of intelligence. It is not uh, it is not there to guide. On the contrary, they but confirm and strengthen this nature. For the more intense sense is more it is really sense, and as it were, have nothing or here are dealing with the religious sense and experience involved in it, and is known to you, venerable brethren. Now necessary in much matter is prudence, and learning by which prudence is guided. You know it from your own dealings with the souls, and especially the souls in whom sentiment predominates. You know it also from your readings of your works of the ascetical theology, works for which the modernists have but little esteem, but which testify to a science and a solidity far greater than theirs, and to a refinement and a subtlety of the observation far beyond any which the modernists take credit to themselves for possessing, and it seems nothing short of madness, at least to consummate timidly to accept for true without inner investigation these incomplete experiences which are the font of modernists. Let us, for a moment, put to question the experiences have such force and value in their estimation. Why do they not attach equal weight to the experience that so many thousands of Catholics have that modernists are on the wrong path? It is that the Catholic experience are the only ones which are false and deceptive. The vast majority of mankind holds and always will hold firmly that sense and experience alone, when not eliminated or enlightened and guided by reason. Cannot reach to the knowledge of God, what then remains but atheism and the absence of all religion? Certainly, it is not the doctrine of symbolism that it will save us from this. For if all the intellectual elements, as they call them, of religion are nothing more than mere symbols of God, will not the very name of God, nor the divine personality, be also a symbol? And if this be omitted, the personality of God will become a matter of doubt, and the gate will be opened to pantheism. And pantheism, pure and simple, and the other doctrine of the divine immanence leads directly. For this is the question which we ask: does or does not the immanence leave God distinct from man? If it does, in what does it differ from the Catholic doctrine? And why does it reject the doctrine of external revelation? If it does not, it is pantheism. Now, the doctrine of immanence in the modernist exception holds the uh, profession that every phenomenon of conscience proceeds from man as man. The rigorous conclusion from this is the identity of man with God, which means pantheism. The distinction which modernists have make between science and faith leads to the same conclusion. The object and the science, they say, is the reality, the knowable, the object of faith, and the contrary is the reality of the unknowable. Now, what makes the unknowable unknowable is the fact that there is no proportion between its object and the intellect. The defect of proportion which nothing whatsoever, even the doctrine of modernism, can suppress. Hence, the unknowable remains and will eternally remain unknowable to the believer as well as the philosopher. Therefore, if any religion it at all is possible, can it be only, or it can only be, the religion of the unknowable reality? And why this might not be the soul of the universe, of which certain rationalists speak, is something which certainly does not seem to us apparent. These reasons suffice to show superabundance by how many modernists led to atheism and the annihilation of all religion. The error of Protestantism made the first step on this path, and the modernism makes the second. Atheism makes the next. Yep. All right, we're in the 40s now. To penetrate still deeper into the meaning of the modernism and to find the suitable remedy for so deep a sore, it behooves us, venerable brethren, to investigate the cause which engenders it, which fosters its growth, and proximate and immediate causes consists in the errors of the mind, cannot be open to doubt. We recognize that the remote causes may be reduced to two curiosity and pride. Curiosity by itself is not prudently regulated, if not prudently regulated, suffices to recount for all errors. Such is the opinion of our predecessor, Gregory the 16th, who wrote, quote, "A lamentable spectacle is that present by the apparitions of human reason, when it yields to the spirit of novelty, when when against the warring of the apostle, it seeks to know beyond what is meant to know, and when relying too much self, it thinks it can find truth outside the Catholic Church, wherein the truth is found without the slightest shadow of error, unquote. But in its pride, which exercises an incomparability greater sway over the soul to the blind it and lead it into error. The pride sits in the modernist as his own house, finding the substance everywhere in its doctrines and lurking in its every aspect. It is pride which fills modernists with the self assertion by which they consider themselves impose the rule for all. It is pride which puffs them up, that the vainglory which allows them to feel or to regard themselves as the sole possessors of knowledge and makes them say, elate and inflated with presumption, quote, we are not as the rest of men, unquote, in which lest that we should seem as other men, leads to embrace and devise novelties, even of the most absurd kind. It is pride which rouses them in the spirit of disobedience and causes them to demand a compromise between the authority and liberty. It is owing to their pride that they seek to be reformers of others while they forget to reform themselves. And they are found to be utterly wanting in respect for authority, even for the supreme authority. Truly, there is no road which leads so directly, so quickly to the modernism as pride. When a Catholic layman or a priest gets to the precept of the Christian life, which alleges us to renounce ourselves if we allow Christ and neglects to tear pride from his heart, then it is too who most of all is fully ripe subject for the errors of modernism. For the reason, for this reason, venerable brethren, it will be your first duty to resist such victims of pride and to employ them only in the lowest and obscurest offices. The higher they try to rise, the lower let them be placed, so that their lowliness of their positions may limit their power in causing damage. And that seems to be the thing that they used to backfire when they got in power. They did all that to the conservatives. That makes sense. Examine most carefully your young clerics by yourselves and by the directors of your seminaries. And when you find the spirit of pride among them, reject them without a compunction from the priesthood. Woe to God that this has always been done with the vigilance and the constancy which were required. Yeah, see, when they got in power, they took Pius X's advice here and they inverted it. So they're keeping good people out of the seminary in a lot of cases, and in other cases, now that they're in power, they're keeping good people that are already in power in very low positions of power. So they had the least amount of power. So they're twisting his words here. All right, number 41. Let's try to get through this. If we pass on from the moral to the intellectual causes of modernism, the first and the chief which presents itself is ignorance. Yes, these very modernists who seek to be esteemed as doctors of the church, who speak so lawfully on modern philosophy and show such contempt for scholasticism, have embraced the one with all the false glamour, precisely because their ignorance of the other has left them without means of being able to recognize confusion of thoughts and to refute sophisticity. Their whole system, containing as it does errors so many and so great, as has been born of the union between faith and false philosophy. Number 42. Would they that put the displayed less zeal and energy in promulgating it, but such in their activity and such in their unwearying labor on behalf of their cause, that one cannot be pained to see them waste such energy in endeavoring to ruin the church, when they might have been on such a service to her had their efforts been better directed. Their artifices to delude men's minds are of two kinds: the first, to remove obstacles from their path; the second, to devise and apply actively and patiently every resource that they can serve to their purpose. They recognize the three chief difficulties which stand in their way are a scholastic method of philosophy, the authority and the tradition of the fathers, and of course the magisterium of the church, and of which they wage unrelenting war against the scholastic philosophy, against and theology, and they use the weapons of ridicule and contempt, whether it is in ignorance or fear or both, that inspires this conduct in them. Certain it is that the passion of novelty is always united in them with hatred and scholasticism, and there is no surer sign that there is no way is tending to modernism when when he begins to show his dislike for the scholastic method. Let the modernists and their admirers remember their preposition condemned by Pius IX. Quote, the method and the principles which have served the ancient doctrines of scholasticism when treating of the theology no longer correspond with the exegesis of our time or the progress of science. Unquote. They exercise in all their ingenuity the effort to weaken the force and falsify the character of the tradition, so as to rob it of all its weight and authority. But for Catholics, nothing will remove the authority of the Second Council of Nicaea, which it condemns those, quote, who dare, after impious fashion of heretics, to deride the ecclesiastical traditions, to invent novelties to some kind, or to endeavor by malice or craft to overthrow any one of the legitimate traditions of the Catholic Church, unquote, nor the declaration of the Fourth Council Constantinople. Quote, we therefore profess to preserve and guard the rules bequeathed to the Holy Catholic and the Apostolic Church by the holy and most illustrious apostles, by the Orthodox councils, both general and local, and by every one of those divine interpreters, the fathers and the doctors of the church. Wherefore the Roman pontiffs, Pius the Fourth and Pius the Ninth, ordered the insertion in the proposition or proposition of the faith in the following declaration: "Quote: I firmly I most firmly admit and embrace the apostolic and ecclesiastical tradition and other observances and continuances in the church and the constitutions in the church." The modernists pass judgments on the holy fathers of the church, even as they do upon tradition. We consummate terminity. They assure the public that the fathers while personally most worthy of all veneration, were entirely ignorant of history and criticism, for which they were only excusable on the account of the time in which they lived. Finally, the modernists tried in every way to diminish and weaken the authority of the ecclesiastical magisterium itself by sacrilegiously falsifying its origin, character, and rights, and by freely repeating the calamities of its adversaries. To the entire band of the modernists may be applied those words which our predecessor sorrowfully wrote, quote, to bring contempt and odium to this mystic spouse of Christ, who is the true light and the children of darkness have been wont to cast in her face before the world the stupid calumny in preventing the meaning and the force of things and words, to depict her as the friend of darkness and the ignorance and the enemies of light, science and progress. Unquote. This being so, venerable brethren, there is little reason to wonder that the modernists vent venerate all their bitterness and hatred on Catholics who zealously fight the battles of the Church. There is no species of insult which they do not heap upon, but their usual course is the charge them with ignorance or obstinacy. When the adversary rises up against them with a reduction and a force and renders them uh, redoubtable, they seek to make a conspiracy of silence around them to nullify the effects of his attacks. This policy towards Catholics is more invidious in they blod with admiration, which knows no bounds. The writers who range themselves on their side, hailing their works, exuding novelty in every page, with a chorus of applause. For them, the scholarship of a writer is a direct proportion of the recklessness of his attacks of iniquity, of an antiquity, sorry, and of his efforts to undermine the tradition and the ecclesiastical magisterium. When one of their numbers falls under the condemnations of the church, the rest of them, to discuss of good Catholics, gather around him loudly and publicly uh, applaud him and hold him up in veneration as almost a martyr for truth. The young, excited and confused by all this glamour of praise and abuse, some of them afraid of being branded as ignorance, others ambitious to rank amongst the learned, and both the classes goaded internally by curiosity and pride, not pro frequency surrender and give themselves up to modernism. The octopus tentacles of modernism are everywhere. And he knew it. He knew it. That's why he's riding so strongly on this. And here we have already some artifices employed by the modernists to exploit their wares. Efforts, or what efforts do they not make to win their new recruits? They seize upon professorships in the seminaries and universities and gradually make their chairs of pestilence and sermons from the pulpits. They dissimulate their doctrines through the possibility in utterances which are veiled. In congresses, they express the teachings more openly. In the social gatherings, they introduce them and commend them to others under their own names and and utter uh, pseudonyms. They publish numbers of books, newspapers, reviews, and sometimes one and the same writer adopt a variety of pseudonyms to trap the incautious reader into believing a multitude of the modernist writers. In short, with a feverish activity, they leave nothing untried in act, speech, and writing, in which what results? We have to deplore the spectacle of many young men, once full of promise and capable of rendering great services to the church, now gone astray. It also it is also a subject of grief to us that many others who, while they are certainly do not go far as the former, have yet been so affected by breathing the poisonous atmosphere. That's what I've been saying, the poisonous atmosphere, as to think and speak and to write with the degree of laxity, with the ills that becomes a Catholic, and they are to be found amongst the laity and the ranks of the clergy, and they are not wanting, even in the last place where one might expect to meet in the religious communities, if they treat the biblical questions, is upon the modernist principles. If they write history, they are carefully, with ill concealed satisfaction, drag it into the light on the plea of telling the whole truth. Everything that appears to cast a stain upon the church under the sway of a certain and priori conceptions, they destroy as far as they can the pious traditions of the people, and bring into disrespect certain relics highly venerable from their antiquity, and they possessed by the uh, empty desire of having their names upon the lips of the public, and they know they would never succeed in this were they to say only what was always been said by all men. Meanwhile, it may be that they have persuaded themselves that all this they are really serving God and the church. In reality, they offend both, less perhaps by their works in themselves than by the spirit in which they write and the encouragements they thus give to the aims of the monarchs, to the modernists. It is against the host of it, against this host of grave errors and its secrets and open advance. Our predecessor Leo the 13th of happy memory worked studiously both in his words and in his acts, especially as regards the study of the Bible. But as we have seen, the modernists are not easily deterred by such weapons. With the affection of great submission and respect, they proceed to twist the words of the pontiff to their own sense, while they describe while they described his action and directed against others than themselves. Thus, the evil has gone on increasingly from day to day. We, therefore, venerable brethren, have decided to suffer no longer delay and to adopt measures which are more efficacious. We exhort and conjure you to see that it is the most grave matter. No one shall be in the position to say that you have been in the slightest degree wanting in vigilance, zeal, and firmness. and what we ask of you and expect of you. What we ask and expect also of all other pastors, of all educators and professors and clerics, in the very special way of the superiors of religious communities. In the first place, with regards to studies, we will strictly ordain in the scholastic philosophy be made the basis of the sacred sciences. It goes without saying that if, quote, if anything is met with amongst the scholastic doctors which may be regarded as something investigated with the excess of subtlety or taught without sufficient consideration, anything which is not in keeping with the certain results of the latter times, anything in short which altogether desolute the probability, we have no desire whatever to propose it for the limitation of the present generations. Unquote. And let it be clearly understood above all things that when we prescribe the scholastic philosophy, we understand chiefly that the angelic doctor has bequeathed us, and we therefore declare that all ordinances of our predecessor on this subject continue fully in force. And as far as may be necessary, we do decree anew and confirm in order that they shall be strictly observed all by all in the seminaries where they have been neglected will be for the bishops to exact and require their observance in the future, and let this apply also to the superiors of the religious communities. Further, we admonish the professors to bear well in mind that they cannot set aside St. Thomas Aquinas, especially in the metaphysical questions, without grave disadvantage. Amen to that. On this philosophical foundation, the theological edifice, it is carefully raised that promote the study of the theology, venerable brethren, by all means in your power, so that the clerics, on leaving the seminaries, may carry them with deep admiration and love of it, and always find it the source of delight. For, quote, it is the vast and varied abundance of studies opening before the mind desires the truth. It is known to everyone that the theology occupies such commanding place that, according to the ancient adage of the wise, it is the duty of the other acts and sciences to serve it, and to wait upon it after the manner of handmaidens. Unquote. And we will add that we will deeply worthy of praise those who are full of respect for tradition, the fathers and the ecclesiastical magisterium endeavor with well balanced judgments and guided by Catholic principles, which are not always the case, to illustrate positive theology by throwing upon it the light of true history. It is certainly necessary that the positive theology should be held in greater appreciation than it has been in the past, but must be done without the detriment to the scholastic theology and those that are to be disproved as modernists who exalt positive theology in such a way as to seem to despise the scholastic. With regard to the secular studies, let us suffice to recall here what our predecessor has admirably said. Quote, apply yourself energetically to the study of the natural sciences, in which the departure of the things that have been so brilliantly discovered and so usefully applied to the admiration of the present age, will be the object of the praise and the commendation to those who come after us. Unquote. But this is to be done without inferring with the sacred studies. And our predecessor described in uh, these most weighty words, quote, if you carefully search for the cause of those errors, you will find that it lies in the fact that these days, when the natural sciences absorb so much study, the more severe and lofty studies have been proportionally neglected. Some of them have almost passed into oblivion. Some of them are pursued in a half hearted, superficial way. And sad to say, now that the splendor of the former estate is dimmed, they have been disfigured by perverse doctrines and monstrous errors. We ordained, therefore, that the study of the natural sciences in the seminaries is to be carried according to this law. Boom. Mic drop again. Can't abandon Thomas Aquinas. Hallelujah. Thank you, Holy Father. All these prescriptions, both of the old and those of our predecessor, are to be kept in the view whenever there is a question of choosing directors and professors for the seminaries and the Catholic universities. Anyone who in any way is found to be tainted with modernism is to be excluded without compunction from these offices, whether of governments or of teaching, or those where already occupy them, are to be removed. The same policy is to be adopted toward those who openly or secretly lend countenance to modernism, either by extolling the modernists or by excusing their culpable conduct, or by carping at scholasticism and the fathers and magisterium of the church, or by refusing obedience to the ecclesiastical authority in any of its dispositories, and towards those who showed the love of novelty in history, archaeology, biblical exegesis, and finally, towards those who neglect the sacred sciences or appear to prefer them to the secular. In all this question of studies, venerable brethren, you cannot be too watchful or constant. But most of all, in the choice of predecessors, for as the rule of the students are modeled after the pattern of their masters, strong in the conscience of their duty, act always in this manner, prudence with vigor. Equal diligence and severity are to be used in examining and selecting candidates for holy orders. Far, far from the clergy to be love of novelty. God hateth the proud and the obstinate mind. For the future of the doctorate of theology and canon law must never be conferred on anyone who has not first of all made the regular course of scholastic philosophy. In conferred, it shall be held as null and void. The rules laid down in 1896 by the Sacred Congregation of Bishops and Regulars for the clerics in both secular and regular of Italy concerning the frequenting of the universities, we now decree to be extending to all nations. Clerics and priests inscribed in the Catholic institute or university must not in the future follow the civil universities, those courses for which there are chairs in Catholic institutes, to which they belong. It has been permitted anywhere in the past. We ordain it that it is not allowed for the future. But the bishops whom form the governing board of such Catholic institutes or universities watch with all care these commands be constantly observed. So, also, the duty of the bishops prevents writing of modernists and whatever savors modernism or promotes it from being read when they have been published and to hinder their publication when they have not. No books, no papers, or periodicals, whatever of this kind, are to be permitted in seminaries or university students. The injury of them would be not less than which caused by the immoral reading. Nay, it would be greater, for such writings poison Christian life at its very font. The same decision is to be taken concerning the writing of some Catholics, who, although not evilly disposed themselves, are ill instructed in theological studies and imbued with modern philosophy, and strive to make and harmonize with the faith, and they say, and turn it into the profit of faith. The name and the reputation of these authors cannot cause them to read without suspicion, and they, therefore, and all are more dangerous in gradually preparing the way of modernism. We are coming to the close very shortly. To some more general directions, venerable brethren, in the matter of such moments, we order that you do everything in your power to drive out your diocese, even by solemn interdicts, by pernicious books that may be in circulation there. The Holy See neglects no means to remove writings of this kind, but their number has now grown to such an extent that it's hardly possible to subject them to all censor. Hence, it happens sometimes that the remedy arrives too late, for the disease has taken root during the delay. We will, therefore, that the bishops, putting aside all fear and prudence in the flesh, despising the glamour of evil men, shall gently, by all means, but firmly do each his own part in this work, remembering the injections of Leo XIII's Apostolic Constitution Officiorum, quotes, let the ordinaries acting in this also as delegates of the Apostolic See exert themselves to prescribe and to put out the reach of the faithful injurious books or others' writings printed or circulated by their diocese. In the passage of the bishops, it is true, received an authorization, but they have also a charge laid upon them. Let no bishop think that he fulfills his duty by denouncing to us one or two books, while a great many others of the same kind are being published and circulated. Nor are you to be deferred by the fact that the book has been obtained elsewhere, the permission which is commonly called the imprimatur, both because it may be merely simulated. Wow, that's a big one. And because it may be granted through carelessness, too much indulgence, or excessive trust placed in the author, which is the last and perhaps sometimes happened in the religious orders. Besides, just as the same food does not agree with everyone, it may happen that the book, harmless in one place, may on one account, on a different circumstance, be hurtful in another. Should a bishop, therefore, after being taken advice of a prudent persons, deem it right to condemn any of such books in his diocese, we give them ample faculty for the purpose that we lay upon him the obligation of doing so. Let this be done in a fitting manner. In the certain cases, it will suffice to restrict the prohibition to the clergy, but in all cases, it will be obligatory on the Catholic booksellers not to put on sale books condemned by a bishop. And while we are entreating on this subject, we wish the bishops to see that the booksellers do not, although desire for gain, engage in evil trade. It is certain that the catalogs of some of them, the books of the modernists, are not frequently announced with no small price. If they refuse obedience, let the bishops, after due admonishments, have no hesitation in deriving them of the title of the Catholic booksellers. This applies with still the more reason to those who have the title of Episcopal booksellers. If they have the pontifical booksellers, let them be denounced to the Apostolic See. Finally, we read the article. We remind all of the article 26 of the above mentioned Constitutional Officiorum quotes all those who have obtained apostolic faculty to read and keep hidden books are not thereby authorized to read and keep books in periodicals forbidden by the local ordinaries unless the apostolic faculty expressly concedes permission to read and keep the books condemned by anyone whatsoever, unquote. We're almost there. We're almost there. All right. It is enough to hinder the reading and the sales of bad books. It is also necessary to prevent them from being published. Hence, let the books use the utmost strictness in granting permission to print. Under the rules of the Constitution Officiorum, many publications require the authorization of the ordinary. In a certain diocese, since the bishop cannot personally make himself acquainted with them all, it has been the custom to have a suitable number of official censors for the examination of writings. We have the highest esteem for the institution of censors, and we not only exhort but order that to be extended to all dioceses and all episcopal curias. Therefore, let the censors be appointed for the revision of the works intended for publication, and let censors be chosen both ranks of the clergy in the secular and the regular. Men whose age, knowledge, and prudence will enable them to follow the safe and golden means of their judgments. It shall be their office to examine everything which requires permission for publication, according to the articles of uh, and according to the articles of the above mentioned Constitution. This censor shall give his verdict in writing. If it is favorable, the bishop will give permission for the publication by the word imprimatur, which must be preceded by the nearly obstat, and the name of the censor. In the Roman Curia, official censors shall be appointed in the same way as elsewhere. In the duty of nominating them shall appertain to the master of the sacred palace. After they have been proposed to the cardinal vicar and have been approved and accepted by the sovereign pontiff, it will be in the office of the master of the sacred place to select the censor for each writing. Permission for publication will be granted by him as well as by the cardinal vicar or uh, vin, vicegerent. And this permission, as above prescribed, must be preceded by the nihil obstat and the name of the censor. Only on the very rare and exceptional occasion, and on the prudent decision of the bishop, shall it be possible to admit admission of the censor. And the name of the censor shall never be rare and exceptional occasion. And on the prudent derision of the bishop, it shall be possible to admit the mention of the censor. The name of the censor shall be made known to the authors until he have given the favorable decision, so he may not suffer the inconvenience either while he is engaged in the examination of the writing, or in the case he should withhold his approval. Censors shall never be chosen from the religious orders until opinions of the provincial or in Rome or in general have privately obtained, and the provincial and the general must wait. I messed that up word. The censors shall never be chosen from the religious orders until the opinion of the parochial or Rome or in general has been privately obtained. The parochial and the general must be conscientious account of the character, knowledge, and orthodoxy of the candidates. We admonish religious superiors of their most solemn duty never to allow anything to be published by any of their subjects without permission from themselves and from the ordinary. Finally, we affirm the declaration that the title of the book with which a person may be honored has no value whatsoever and can never be adduced to give credit to private opinions of him who hold it. And oh, we're so close. So close. Having said this, in general, we now obtain the particular and more careful observance of the article of the above mentioned Constitution Officiorum, according to which it is forbidden to secular priests without the previous consent of the ordinary to undertake the editorialship of papers or periodicals. This permission shall be withdrawn from any priest who makes the wrong use of it, having received an admonishment thereupon. With regard to the priests who are correspondents or collaborators of periodicals, as it happens not frequently, they contribute matter infected with modernism. In their papers or periodicals, let the bishops see it. They do uh, not offend in this manner. And if they do, let them warn their offenders and prevent them from writing. We solemnly charge in like manner the superiors of the religious orders that they fulfill in the same duty, and should they fail in it, let the bishops make due provision with the authority from which the pontiffs supreme pontiff, let there be, as far as is possible, a special censor for the newspapers and the periodicals written by the Catholics. It shall be his office to be read in due time, each number after it has been published. And if he find anything dangerous in it, let him order that it be corrected as soon as possible, and the bishop shall have the same right, even when the censor has nothing objectionable in publication. We've already mentioned the congresses and the public gatherings above, um, as amongst the means used by the monarchists to promulgate to defend their opinions in the future. Bishops shall not permit congresses of priests except on very rare circumstances, on very rare occasions. When they do permit them, shall only be on uh, condition on that matters appearancing to the bishops or the apostolic see not treated in them, and that no resolutions or petitions be allowed that would imply the usurpation of sacred authority, and that the absolutely nothing be said in which savors the modernism, Presbyterianism, or laicism, or laicism. At congresses at this kind, which can only be held after the permission in the writings has been obtained in due time. In each case, it shall not be lawful for priests in other dioceses, the priests of other dioceses, to be present without written permission of their ordinary. Further, no priest must lose sight of the solemn recommendation of Leo the 13th, quote, let the priests hold as a sacred the authority of their pastors. Let them take it for the certain and the sacerdotal ministry, if not exercised under the guidance of the bishops, can never either can never be either holy or very fruitful or worthy of respect. Wow. All right. But what avail the venerable brethren with all our commands and prescriptions if it be not dutifully and firmly carried out? In order that this may be done, it has seemed expedient to us to extend to all the dioceses and regulations which the bishops of Umbra, with great wisdom, laid down for their many years ago, in order, they say, to extirpate the errors already promulgated and prevent their further diffusion, and to remove these teachers and piety through whom the pernicious effects of such diffusions are being perpetuated. And the sacred assembly, following the example of the St. Charles Borromeo, has decided to establish in each of the dioceses of the council, consisting of approved members of both branches of the clergy, which shall be charged with the task of noting the existence of errors and the devices of which the new ones are introduced and promulgated, and inform the bishop of the whole, so that they take counsel with them the best means the best means for suppressing the evil at the outset and preventing it spread from the ruin of souls, or worse still, gaining strength and growth. We decree, therefore, that in the every diocese and council of this kind, which we have pleased to name the Council of Vigilance, unquote, be instituted without delay. The priests called to form part in shall be chosen somewhat after the manner above prescribed for our censors, and they shall meet every 2 months on the appointed day in the presence of the bishop. They should be bound to secrecy as to their deliberations and decisions, and their functions shall be included and following. They shall uh, most carefully for every trace and the sign of modernism, both the publications and the teachings, and preserve the clergy and the young from it shall take all prudent and prompt and efficacious measures. Let them combat the novelties of words, remembering the admonishments of Leo the 13th. It is impossible to approve in the Catholic publications a style inspiration by unsound novelty, which seem to deride the piety of the faithful and dwell in the indoctrination of the new order of Christian life, of the new direction of the church, of the new inspirations of the modern soul, on the new social vocation of the clergy, on a new Christian civilization, and many other things of the same kind. Language are of the kind here indicated is not to be tolerated either in books or in lectures. The councils must not neglect the books treating the pious transitions of different places or of sacred relics. Let them not permit each question to be discussed in the journals and periodicals destined for foster piety with the expressions savoring the mockery or the contempt or by the dogmatic pronouncements, especially when, as is often the case, what is stated as certainty either does not pass the limits of probability or is based on the prejudiced opinion. Concerning the sacred relics, let this be the rule. If the bishops, who alone are the judges in such matters, know that for certain that a relic is not genuine, let them not approve it at once, or let them approve it at once from the, or let them remove it uh, at once from the veneration of the faithful. If the authenticities of a relic happen to have been lost through civil disturbances or in some any other way, let it be exposed for the public veneration. Let it not be exposed for public veneration until the bishop have verified it. The argumentation, the argument prescription is well founded. A presumption to have a way only when devotion is a relic as commendable by reason and authenticity. According to the sense of the decree issued in 1896 by the Congregation of Indulgences and Sacred Relics, the ancient relics are to retain the veneration they have always enjoyed, except when individual instances there are clear arguments they are false or superstitious. In passing judgments on the pious and the traditions, let it always be borne in mind that the matter of the church uses the greatest prudence, and that she does not allow traditions of this kind to be narrated in books, except when the utmost caution and the assertion of the declaration be imposed by Pope Urban the Eighth. And even then, she does not guarantee the truths of the fact narrated. She simply does not forbid belief in the things which human evidence is not wanting. On this matter, the Sacred Congregation of Rites 30 years ago decreed as follows: the apparitions or revelations have neither been approved nor condemned by the Holy See, which have which has simply allowed them to be believed on purely human faith, on tradition which they relate, or collaborated by testimony or documents worthy of credence. Anyone who follows this rule has no cause to fear, for the devotion based on any apparition insofar as they regard the fact itself, that is to say, so far as the devotion is relative, always implies the condition of the fact of being true, while it is so far as it is absolute and it is always based on the truth, seeing that it is the object of the persons of the saints who are honored. The same is true of relics. Finally, we entrust to the council of vigilance the duty of overlooking assiduous and diligently social institutions as well as all writings on social questions, so they may harbor no trace of modernism, but obey the prescriptions of the Roman pontiffs. Wow. Lest what we have laid down thus far should pass into oblivion, we will uh, we will and ordain the bishops of all dioceses a year after the publication of these letters, and every 3 years thenceforth furnish the Holy See with the diligence and sworn report on these things which have been decreed on this letter, uh, on this our letter, and on this doctrine that on these doctrines that find currency amongst the clergy, and especially the seminaries and other Catholic institutions, those not accepted, which are not subject to the ordinary. We impose, like the obligation of the generals of the religious orders, with regard of those who are under them. This, venerable brethren, is what we have thought in our duty to write to you for the salvation of all who believe. The adversaries of the church will doubtlessly abuse what we have said to refurbish the old calumny by which we are traduced as the enemy of science and as the progress of humanity. As a fresh answer to such accusations, which the history of the Christian religion refutes by never failing evidence, our intention is to establish by every means in our power a special institution in which, through the cooperation of those Catholics who are the most eminent for their learning and the advance of science, for the advance of science and every other department of the knowledge, may be promoted under the guidance and the teachings of the Catholic truth. God grants that we happily realize our design and the assistance of all those who bear the sincere love for the Church of Christ. But this we propose to speak on another occasion. Meanwhile, venerable brethren, fully confident in your zeal and energy, we beseech for you with our whole heart and with the abundance of heavenly light, so that in the midst of the great danger to the souls from the assiduous invasions of error upon every hand, you may see clearly and ought to be done, and the labor to do it with all your strength and courage. May Jesus Christ, the author and finisher of our faith, be with you in his power, and may the Immaculate Virgin, the destroyer of all heresies, be with you by your prayers and aid. And we, as a pledge of our affection and the divine solace in adversition, most lovingly grant to you your clergy and people apostolic benediction. Whoa, no. Okay, there we go. And that is the end. Number 58. Given at St. Peter's in Rome, September 8th, 1907 AD, in the 5th year of our pontificate, Pope Pius X. Boom. Wow. 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 1 second. So much meat and weight on that document. You really see the things that he was fighting against, even prior to the breaking of the First World War. I mean, he was not Pope during World War One, but he was Pope for a very short amount of time, and he followed Leo's witness of what was going on back when Pope Leo the 13th was Pope, and he also saw and wrote a number of stuff on what Gregory the Ninth did too. A lot of this stuff that was happening today was happening back then, but even before that. And it really is interesting how that the decrees that he announced have unfortunately been used to be a switcheroo. Unfortunately, it seems like a lot of people are in power. They're preventing people from getting into the church, preventing people from actually speaking in the church, and preventing people from actually uh, speaking the truth. These are men that are not necessarily orthodox, sound men. In many cases, they are heterodox men in power who are now in the proximity of holding the barrier and holding people back. And the church, unfortunately, has turned down many people from entering seminaries for a variety of reasons. And I have no doubt they kind of weaponized this document in some way and twisted the Pope's words and applied it in some ways to today. It's very possible because there's plenty of good men that should be welcomed in the seminary, but for one reason or another, they're not allowed. Um, it's just there's so much in this document, but this almost need to do a part two. That's going to be slightly shorter of a commentary because like if I go on too much longer, this video is going to be 4-hour live stream. So this video has to end. It is almost 8 o'clock at night. So God bless.